Let's do it. It's go time.
Welcome to Go Time, your source for wide-ranging discussions from all around the Go community. Find us on the web at gotime.fm, on the Fediverse at gotime, at changelog.social, and on X at gotimefm. Thanks to our partners at fly.io, the home of changelog.com. Launch your app as close to your users as possible. Find out how at fly.io. Okay, here we go.
What's up, friends? Do you remember when ChatGPT launched? I do. It felt like the LLM was this magical tool out of the box. However, the more you use it, the more you realize that's just not the case. The technology is brilliant, don't get me wrong, but it's prone to issues like hallucination on its own, but there's hope. There is still hope. Feed the LLM reliable current data, ground it in the right data and context, then and only then can it make the right connections and give the right answers. The team at Neo4j has been exploring how to get results by pairing LLMs with knowledge graphs and vector search. Check out their podcast episode about LLMs and knowledge graphs throughout 2023 at graphstuff.fm. They share tips on retrieval methods, prompt engineering, and so much more. Don't miss it. Find a link in our show notes. Yes, check it out, graphstuff.fm, episode 23.
My name is Natalie Pistunovic, and today's episode is the first of several on the topic of migrating to Go. And we start with migrating from PHP, and the guests for today are Matt, Boyle, and Chris Shepherd. Hi guys, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, good, thanks.
It's really great that we get to record in the middle of the day in Europe time. Usually we do the recording in the evening, and that's new for me, so I'm really enjoying it. Hope it works nicely with your day. Are you more of morning or afternoon or evening people?
So I don't know about Matt, but I'm definitely more of an evening person myself. But no, it is nice to be doing this in the daytime.
Yeah, I'm the complete opposite. I get up really early. I typically get up by 6, and then I'm usually in bed by like 9 p.m. And then usually I wake up to a flurry of messages from Chris, who's been doing stuff till like 1 or 2 a.m. And I used to be that person, but I'm really not anymore.
Same here. Very much of a morning person. Cool. So Chris sending you messages. You both are colleagues, and you were colleagues in your previous job. What do you guys do and where? And what did you do before that?
Yeah, so I think we've worked together now for roughly 6 years, maybe. We're both currently working at Cloudflare. And then before that, we worked for a fintech company startup in London called Curve. I've been at Cloudflare myself for about 3 years. I think Matt's been there slightly longer than I have.
Yeah, I've been there 4 years now, I think. But Chris and I, we worked at Curve in the same team, and then we weren't in the same team, and then we were in the same team. And then at Cloudflare, we were in the same team, then we weren't again, then we were again for a bit, and now we've just parted ways for another time. So I'm the engineering manager for a team called Developer Tools. We build internal tooling, and Chris has just moved over into like our data organization, which is pretty cool. They're the ones who kind of deal with the large volume of requests that make their way from Cloudflare's edge to the core and do a bunch of processing and clever things with it. So very cool team to be a part of, I think.
And you are mostly using Go, but you used to use PHP. Silence, maybe. Okay.
Yeah. So I was just trying to figure out so we didn't speak over each other. But yeah, so Chris and I worked together at Curve, as we said. Curve was, when we joined, it was predominantly PHP. Like the sort of the first version of Curve was being built in PHP. And actually before that, I'd worked in PHP at another company too. And when we joined, one of the reasons that Curve was kind of increasing its size and developing its engineering teams was obviously to go to market faster. But some of the things that we were trying to do, I don't want to say we were hitting limitations of PHP, because I think it's been proven by multiple people that you can take PHP surprisingly far. But I think the way I think about it more, I guess, is that we'd identified a need to start maybe splitting out the competencies of the monolith so that we could move faster in different directions. And we were no longer going to invest in PHP, right? We were going to kind of strangle it out, and we were going to build around it in Go, which was the choice that was made at the time. And Cloudflare actually did something very similar. Cloudflare was also, people might not believe this, but Cloudflare started life as a PHP monolith too. And similar sort of approach, like it's still PHP in Cloudflare stack, very small amount, but we don't really develop or invest in it beyond what we have to anymore. And we build most of our newer systems and competencies, we build them in Go. And at Cloudflare, more and more we're seeing use of Rust as well, which is interesting. I haven't wrote any Rust yet. I don't know if you have, Chris, but it's becoming more and more popular, I see.
No, neither have I. I've not really used much Rust, to be honest. I think one thing that's common between both Cloudflare and Curve is like our intention was never to completely rebuild everything in Go. It was more new things will be built in Go and we'll leave the PHP as it is. But I think over time, our mindset shifted a little bit, and I think many, many more things got migrated to Go as we were working on it.
And do you know what brought this decision or what introduced Go generally to the team?
Yeah, I think there was in London especially, I'm sure you've seen this, Natalie, in Europe generally, but quite a lot of the fintechs seem to have picked Go. So I think there was definitely a strategic hiring element to it, right? Like I think this all started with Monzo. That's my reading of the situation. But Monzo did a great job.
Monzo is the large UK-based digital bank.
Yeah, sorry. I just assume everyone knows what it is because it's so popular here, but maybe not in Europe. But yeah, Monzo's a huge digital-first bank. It was probably one of the, I don't want to say the first, but it was certainly one of the first sort of modern challenger banks. But one thing they did exceptionally well was they were incredibly transparent about how they were building and the challenges they faced. And they started life with Go microservices because a lot of the team had come from another company previously where they'd basically learned a bunch of lessons that they felt they could hit the ground running at Monzo, and it would help them as they scale things out. And one of my favorite Go conference speakers, or just conference speakers in general, is Suhail Patel, who's still at Monzo. He's a staff engineer there, and he still talks about this to this day. And I think it's been a really good decision for them. But one advantage for companies on the periphery, I guess, is there was a whole bunch of people who really were excited about joining Monzo, wanted to do what they were doing, and there's people looking to leave, maybe looking for different opportunities. And if there was other fintechs in the same space who were going to be using the similar tech stack, it meant that we could be moving faster, we could leverage their expertise. So that's one of the reasons I think perhaps we looked at it. But there's also some more like technical reasons. Like we were certainly seeing performance issues with PHP. It was pretty challenging I think it is possible to get more performance out of it, but it's a hell of a lot easier in Go. Even bad Go is incredibly performant. And then I guess another thing that I've seen in more recent years as well, is especially more at Cloudflare, is we've been really successful hiring people who don't know Go and getting them productive in literally like a week or two. We have people putting things in productions like in a week or two, which I've never really seen for any other language.
Oh, that's very fast.
Yeah, I've seen this before, like maybe the Node ecosystem, but I've never really seen it in any of the other ecosystems. Like PHP was quite hard. Our PHP at Curve especially was quite hard to get onboarded to. And I've worked in places before where we've used Java, and getting people used to abstract bean entity factories was always challenging too,
So question to you both. When you started using Go, how long did it take you? Did you learn that? You did not learn that as a first language, so you came with a background from some other language. When you started working in Go, how much experience did you have from private projects? Did you learn on the go? How fast did you start deploying to production?
Yeah, so it's actually funny that Matt mentioned Monzo before, because I think that's how I got into Go, to be honest. I wanted to work in fintech originally, and I think I was reading the Monzo blogs and I heard about Go through that. So I started playing around with it in my spare time, just building things like nothing large, just like very small applications. And then I was looking for jobs in fintech and Go at the same time, and that's how I came across Curve. So when I joined Curve, I had very minimal experience. I built a few things maybe for a couple of months. I've been using Go. But when I got to Curve, like Matt said, I think within the first week or two, I was pushing things to production. So it does show how easy it is to get started on Go and how quickly you can get onboarded like that.
Similar answer for me, I think. I think I started out as a hobbyist. I don't think I particularly found it because of Monzo, but the place I was working at the time had a Go aficionado who was like writing small pieces for production there, and I was just asking him questions and learning a little bit more about it. And I kind of just really liked how simple it was to get going. It was one of the first languages where I watched a couple of tutorials and I could build something useful. And I'd never really experienced that before because previous to that, I tried to learn Laravel, the PHP framework. And it was very easy to be productive in. But when things went wrong, I didn't understand why they went wrong. The error messages didn't make sense to me. And me and Chris have joked about before, if you've used Java Spring Boot, it's great while it works. But like as soon as it starts throwing errors at you and you just copy and paste them into we're probably showing our age at this point, but like putting them in Stack Overflow and figuring out what they mean was basically the only way to proceed. I'm sure ChatGPT can do a much better job these days of helping you figure those out. Whereas I found Go quite intuitive. So similar thing, I actually was actively looking for a job where I could use Go at work rather than it being at home. So I like to think I joined Curve and was relatively productive relatively quickly, but in my experience since then, we've hired tons of people at Cloudflare and at Curve who were predominantly from object-oriented backgrounds, like Java and PHP were popular ones. And we found people from those backgrounds especially really can be productive in the 1 to 2 weeks that Chris said there.
Curve of productivity, I guess, made it an easy sell to whoever made the decision to move from PHP to Go.
Yeah, and I think the really nice thing about there's lots of criticisms of microservices, and there's definitely an argument that more folks should start life as a monolithic application in a single language, and you break chunks out. In this situation, I think being able to write small chunks of code in a microservice in Go in this instance is kind of nice, because it meant that we could kind of safely try it and see if it works and see if it has the profile and the performance index that we were looking for before kind of going all in on it, right? And if it's not the perfect decision, you can then start to look at other options. And also you can use different options for different languages. And this is kind of where Cloudflare's at now, right? So I would say, I don't think this is kind of official, but like Go is our sensible default. If you are looking to build something at Cloudflare in the core, which is Kubernetes, Go is probably where you should start. We've got a bunch of libraries and a good ecosystem around it. But that's not to say that if you've got a specific task where it makes sense to look at Rust or to look at some of the other languages out there. For example, the really obvious example is if you're doing something in the machine learning ecosystem, Python's probably the way to go. Like Go just does not have that support yet for AI. I hope it comes, but it's certainly not there today. So, trying to square peg round hole is not the right thing to do. And just, you may as well leverage the great Python ecosystem that's out there. But once we started to write Go, and to this day, I continue to see this, like, it's really hard to come up with reasons not to, especially for typical HTTP servers, gRPC servers, like database interaction, CLIs, like those sort of simple use cases, typical use cases, because the performance is just phenomenal for very little effort. You don't need to be an expert to get exceptional performance out of it. So it's certainly become my sensible default throughout my career as well.
So can you share some of the challenges that you had in migrating, or like some stories, or generally talk about the migration process? How did you start? How, not about building the new things, but actually the carrying out from PHP to Go. For those who want to do that, or for those who consider doing that, any learnings are interesting.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge I saw, at least when we were moving from PHP to Go, was probably like the expectation that we were going to move everything. I think originally we didn't have that kind of opinion, but over time we kind of thought that there would be a world where we probably wouldn't have the PHP anymore, and we were kind of planning for that eventuality. But in my experience, like these things, like, we'll never fully get rid of the PHP, and we shouldn't. I mean, and I don't think it makes sense to migrate everything, to be honest, in most cases. But we're in this situation where we're kind of building things for life after PHP, but we're probably never going to get to that point. So it brings challenges, because we could potentially have inconsistencies between the data that we have in two places, and ultimately we have to build around having these two different systems that have similar purposes, but are completely separate. So I think for me, I think it just being pragmatic about what's definitely going to be around forever and what's not going to be around, I think, is the biggest learning I took from it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good call out. And I think the only thing I would build on top of that with is any challenges you're facing with your monolithic application, you're going to experience 10 times more with a distributed system. So you need to go into that eyes open and be aware that, especially as you go through this journey of starting to move, if you are going to run this, there's two ways to do this migration, right? You can down tools and literally rewrite your whole application in Go and then ship that. And maybe there's a class of company that's small enough where maybe that makes sense. I can't think of any. I think I'd get a bit of a red flag if someone told me to do that or asked me to do that. But generally it's an approach that's valuable. To Chris's point, like, I think most people are going to adopt this sort of, we called it like the strangler pattern, right? Is you either build new pieces around the edge until the PHP becomes such a small part of your ecosystem that it's either really quick to rewrite because it's become sort of irrelevant, or it's become such a small part, you just let it continue to do the things that it's been doing well, and you just continue to build your new competencies in other languages. I think that makes a lot more sense as an approach. The huge downside is now you've got all these systems, or at least two systems, your Go system and your PHP system, talking to each other. And the network's going to fail. It definitely will. You might not think it will, but it will. So you've got to make sure you've got things in place for this. So, just getting into the habit of having retries built into your application, or deploying it in some way that you've got like a service mesh that does some of these retries for you. Chris touched on sort of like data synchronization issues. Like that can be a problem if you are trying to have two different views of let's imagine you have a customer and you have multiple different systems that have like a view of a customer. Like one of them is the source of record. The others are going to have to be somewhat out of sync. So you've got to kind of think about this ahead of time and think about what does it mean to have consistent data. If you've been building a monolith before, all of this is probably new challenges to you, and you've got to be ready for them because they're really, really hard. And so making sure you invest in your infrastructure team, observability becomes really important. So these moves do tend to be pretty expensive. And so you've got to make sure it makes sense for your business. You're going to get what you want out of this, like this migration, this refactor, this rewrite, this commitment to a new tech stack before you kind of go on this journey, because it sounds really fun and it is really fun, but when it goes wrong, it can be incredibly painful.
Can you share some of the going wrong stories from either of the migrations you had?
I think you shared one at your GopherCon talk recently, Chris, right? Do you want to share that one?
Yeah, actually, I do have a good story I can tell. So it was actually a few weeks into my time at Curve. I had not been there very long, and it was my first time even with any experience on microservices. I only worked kind of on monolithic applications before that. So to what Matt said, like there is definitely a learning curve, and it's definitely a lot of challenges that you don't typically face with monoliths. I actually had a very simple ticket to migrate a data type to change a data type from a string to a timestamp and basically first was for the card state. It was one of the fields on the card state, basically for cards in the app. And I didn't really think about, I didn't have a lot of experience at the time, so I didn't really think about breaking changes and things like that. So I made this change. It passed our test, like our automation test framework. It passed all the tests. It got approved. Everyone was happy with it. I deployed it and didn't realize that we had another service basically sat between this and the app. And that service, because of the way it handled the new time, because of the breaking change and the way it handled the new data type, it started marking everyone's card as deleted. So I think we had about a 20-minute period where every single user in the app looked like their account had been wiped. So it wasn't probably my best moment, to be honest. Luckily, we did fix it, and it did highlight a bunch of other issues. But yeah, I learned a very valuable lesson from that.
Matthew, you have a story to share.
Yeah, I was just thinking. I think there's been... So Chris's example is a really good one of a very clear issue, I think we saw very quickly that we'd broken the app, and we got lots of complaints and we could see ourselves. But I think some of maybe a more subtle one that's more interesting to share just from a different angle is like the data consistency issues is a really interesting one. So I'm trying to think of a specific example where we've seen it, but obviously if you're using something like Postgres and you're replicating the data, and we call it replication lag, where it's taking a long time to replicate. Maybe it's taking 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, and you're using that database, that secondary database, as the source for all your reads in your application, right? And you're sort of 8 minutes behind, 10 minutes behind, 15 minutes behind where you need to be. Like I can't actually think top of mind of a really concrete example where it's been an issue. And one of the reasons for that is it's actually really hard to figure out that that's an issue. It doesn't show up on any of your dashboards as customers are having errors or seeing issues. Like the only sort of symptom of it is that replication lag. And so just having that experience and that observability up front is really important. So that's actually a metric we track really closely at Cloudflare. But until I joined Cloudflare, I hadn't really ever thought about tracking it as a metric. So
how do you call that metric?
It's called replication lag, yeah.
And it's measured in minutes?
Ideally, it's in seconds.
Okay.
But it's definitely shown up for us in minutes before. It's basically the difference between, if you have a primary database, like a primary Postgres database, let's say it's running in one AWS in London, and you have a secondary in Ireland. Like, what's the difference between you writing to the Postgres database in London and it showing up in the Ireland database? And that's the one you're actually using for your reads. Like, that's what we're measuring. And it's a really common pattern that I'm sure we've all used, where we write to the primary and we read from the secondaries to remove some load from the primary, the writer. And if you're not measuring that, then chances are you could potentially be seeing this replication issue where your customers are being served potentially stale data. And depending on your use case, your business case, like, that could be a big problem. But it's going to be really, really hard for you to debug. And it's going to be really, really hard for you. It's not going to show up on any of your error dashboards or anything like that unless you're tracking that specific metric. And I think the more you dig into distributed systems, you'll find depending on like what your stack looks like, you'll find a bunch of different metrics and things like that. They're like, oh, that looks weird. Like, maybe we should be tracking that one. That's it's having customer impact, but we didn't necessarily know it was. So these aren't Go specific issues. Like, whatever migration you go from, if you start to move into a more distributed world, like, you're going to start to see some of these things. And these are super interesting problems. I love them, but they are much harder than dealing with like a monolithic application with a single Postgres instance. Like, that's the ultimate place to be as a small team, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think the one worrying thing about that kind of issue as well is if we're not tracking it, then we are relying on a customer to raise it, like, when they see that error. And it's a safe bet that, like, if one customer's seen it and raised it, you've got many, many other customers who've seen it and just not raised it. So yeah, it's a challenging one, and it's definitely something to bear in mind, because like, customers 99% of the time are probably not going to raise it unless it's someone who really cares about the product.
Yeah, interesting learning, the replication lag. That's a good recommendation, not even related to migrations. Were there any interesting behaviors you noticed when you migrated some code base from PHP to Go? Like, maybe you had to change the way that it's written to do it more the Go way, and then it somehow affected the behavior, or any interesting things you stumbled upon?
There's a few things I would call out that come to mind immediately. So the first one is, I think I mentioned it briefly at the start, but like, the performance profile of Go was noticeable immediately. Like, we had, systems that were sort of struggling along at sort of 10 requests per second that were using like a bunch of CPU and memory. And then all of a sudden they were using, like, they could do thousands of requests a second, and they were using barely any CPU and memory. And like, we didn't do anything clever. We just wrote in Go what we were about to write in PHP, right? And that was that was really eye-opening to me. That was one of the first things I remember sort of being really shocked about. The second was maybe slightly niche and not for everybody, but containerization of a Go app versus a PHP app. Like, you literally need a PhD to containerize a PHP app. At least you did. It was really complicated to figure out. At least the way we were doing it, it was really, really challenging. And I think seem to remember our PHP container images were like a couple of gig, and then we moved to this like distroless Go, and they were like 13 megabytes. Like, it was astoundingly different. And if you're running these workloads somewhere where you pay for nodes or space or whatever, like, that can be really significant. To be able to have like such a smaller profile was amazing. And then the third thing that really jumped out to me was like developer experience. So PHP has this like debugging path called Xdebug. I truthfully never got it set up. Like, I could never figure it out. Like, you had to kind of do some clever stuff to get it working, and I could never get it working. I've tried a few times at various points in my career. Like, with Go, it really was a case of like, set a breakpoint, hit debug, and it worked. Recompiling the application was super quick. So coming from like Java and PHP to Go, like, the developer experience was like a huge one for me. Like, and even like silly things like running your unit tests and them running in a couple of seconds versus like having to wait multiple minutes in some cases in some of these older stacks was a really nice and very welcome change. Until
the replication lag was over.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think just to piggyback on kind of both of the points that Matt made, like, for me, when moving to Go, it was just shocking how quickly you could deploy and run an application. Like, coming from a Java background where it takes like seconds and seconds for an application to actually start up, in Go they start up in milliseconds. And I think just because it's designed for distributed systems, it makes it so easy to build these small applications and run them in Kubernetes or in Docker, like Matt said. And on the other point about productivity, it's the same with that. Like, the tooling around Go is just so great. Like, it's so easy to go and run tests. Like, you can just run Go test on any project, and for the most part, it will just run the tests. Whereas honestly, like, try and do that in Java, it's pretty challenging to do it with a single command without having like additional libraries and things like that. So yeah, like, I agree to both Matt's points. Like, but developer experience is excellent as well.
To throw some balance into this conversation, I know it's a Go podcast, but there was some things I remember at the time specifically that really sucked about Go as well. So at the time, it was pre-Go modules that we were doing this. And I don't know if you remember the Go path, Natalie, where you had to put stuff in specific places or it just didn't work. Like figuring that out was really hard. And I remember I was wasting like a bunch of time, like trying to help people figure out like Go path and getting everything working and just thinking that way. That was really, really challenging. So that was one thing that I remember was kind of sucky. Like PHP's dependency management ecosystem was very mature. It worked. And Go's at this time was not. It was pretty poor. And Go modules like really saved our bacon on that one. Like I was very glad when, I know a lot of people have got criticism of Go modules, but considering where we came from, like it's substantially better. And then the other one, I guess I'd call out, it's probably less true today, but at the time, there was so much documentation and learning resources and stuff for PHP, and there wasn't very much for Go at all. So there would be things you'd try and look up, and there wasn't really a good solution for it, or you'd be looking for libraries, and they didn't really exist, or they'd be very immature. So you had to be willing to kind of get stuck in and either make open source contributions or roll your own thing.
The lack of libraries is a little bit like the Go thing, right? You should use what you have and don't like export libraries for what you don't.
Yeah, and I think that's another learning, isn't it, that you kind of have to pick up as you go with Go, is if you go and write JavaScript, like, you know, the left pad incident is famous, where everyone was depending on this really small module to do like something very minor. And I think that comes with people from a lot of other languages. Like if you do come from PHP and Java, like it's not unusual to pull in dependencies, and you know, you get they're called POM files. Well, I can't remember what the Java things were called. I think they're called POM files. Like that, you could get huge ones, and the dependency management thing was like quite well managed, and there was enterprise solutions for dependency management available to you. Whereas kind of coming around to, actually, I should try and implement this myself in Go, and I should, you know, manage and own this myself. Like, what's the idiom? A little copying and pasting is better than a little dependency. Like coming around to that way of thinking definitely took me some time, and it kind of takes everyone who jumps into the Go ecosystem a tiny bit of time to get to grips with, I think. So especially when we were doing this was unusual. And also being able to like type things into Google and not always finding an answer was unusual too, especially if you're used to Java, where there was 20 years of experience available on the internet for you.
What's up, Go Time? Adam here in the breaks, talking to Sagar Bachu, co-founder and CEO of Speakeasy. Speakeasy is the complete platform for great API developer experience. Generate SDKs in TypeScript, Python, Go, Java, C#, and PHP. You know what, Sagar, imagine I have some listeners who write Go, because, you know, they're listening to Go Time. And they say, I maintain our SDK, and I don't mind doing it, but I realize there are ways to generate our SDKs using the open API specification. Now, give me an exact workflow end to end, from curious to leveraging Speakeasy to generate and maintain SDKs for an API written in Go.
Let's take the case of you're building an API from scratch today. If you're building an API in Go, you're probably going to start with one of the common frameworks to build a Go API. I would highly encourage looking at frameworks like Goa and Shuma, which actually give you a lot of scaffolding out of the box to not just write your API, but also to make sure that you get an open API spec generated off of each build of your API. That is like a really great foundational building block to invest in as a company, because that means all future development of the API is guaranteed to be described and documented out of the box. Once you do that, it's, I think, a good idea to have some basic concepts of ownership built in. So if you have multiple services or microservices, make sure your service is annotated by teams that own it, and then also give your resources simple names that get reflected in the open API spec. Once you do that, the spec is going to get created every time you build your API. So through CI/CD, your spec will get generated every time you build and host the API. Make sure that spec gets pushed to a change management solution. I think that's where Speakeasy can come in. You actually push the spec to us on every build, and we'll create a version snapshot of it. So you have it we give you prominence of it, so you have it for future builds and future work that you want to do on it. Once that happens, you can attempt to generate an SDK. and will hook directly into your CI/CD and grab the latest version of the spec. Every time that happens, we'll compare the spec to a previous version, tell you if there's any breaking changes, and send you a pull request on any repo to generate that new code. Once you get to that first version of the SDK, that's where you really want to do some human-in-the-loop investment and take a look at, does the SDK suit your needs? Is it ergonomic in the way you think it should be? And then also is it documented? Is it described well? If there are gaps in that documentation, you can go back and add that in your code base. But if this is not a new API and this is a legacy API, you can use tools like overlays to actually add in that documentation without altering the original spec itself or altering the source code. So you do some investment there to make sure that the SDK output is ergonomic, well described and documented. And once that happens, you kind of set us an autopilot. So every time your spec changes, Speakeasy will send you new pull requests. And once you merge a pull request, it gets published and released on GitHub. Thank God Go doesn't have a separate package manager. It's all GitHub. So the moment the Git repo is updated, you get a brand new SDK version released to your customers. That's the complete workflow, all the way from your API server to your CI/CD to actually having generated and hosted SDK.
So take me in as close as you can. Give me an ant's eyes view. Why is this beneficial for a team?
I think it's really beneficial when you start thinking about growth and scaling the company. The moment you have more than one developer touching an API, let's say you have 2 and 3 developers touching and iterating on an API, you want all those changes to be captured and documented somewhere so that someone else, not necessarily the same developer, can decide whether that API needs to get distributed to outside the company. Doing that upfront investment means every API change is described and documented, and every N+1 developer that comes on the team is also going to onboard that much faster, right? Because everything, like you're not going to need to know about how every service is constructed. You're just going to be able to look at the open API spec and say, we have 3 APIs today. 2 of them are generally available, one's in beta, and then one's on V1 and one's on V2, right? That's like you at the most granular level, like that upfront documentation means you're going to be able to move a lot faster on other development going forward. So I would say like that's if I had to say one huge benefit of that is doing that upfront investment means every developer building an API going forward is not going to have to like learn all the context of every API. It's just going to be there described in a simple single document.
Okay, go to speakeasyapi.dev. You get your first SDK generator for free. Once again, speakeasyapi.dev, and tell them GoTime sent you.
This is something that I recently mentioned in some other podcasts where I was a guest, that this is the Go way of doing things. And then somebody wrote me an email saying, I didn't find any documentation for this. Can you like back your claim? And so I approached the Go team, and Cameron, the lead, actually replied to me. I'm looking for the exact quote. The Go programming philosophy encourages using trustworthy dependencies. While I said something like, the Go programming philosophy encourages using the standard library as much as possible. And when the standard library is not solving it, generally prefer writing code over importing third party. So just for the very historic accuracy, in case anybody follows up with a back your claim, it is not written anywhere. But here you have the philosophy. The Go programming philosophy encourages using trustworthy dependencies. But it still somehow feels that it's almost like a common knowledge, right? That you don't import as much as you write. Now I'm very curious, where did this come from? But it's something that kind of people know.
Yeah, I think, so there's maybe I can share a link in the show notes, but there's a video of the Go idioms. I'm trying to very quickly pull up when they were first spoken about, but I seem to think Dave Cheney was responsible in some way for these. So I'm going to say around 2016. They were kind of shared as like, hey, well, maybe we should think about things this way. And I do know like the Go team have kind of used those and repeated them too. So I think at least since 2015, 2016, like they've been kind of widely shared as, I think you used a great word actually, like philosophy. That seems like the right way to think about it, I think, doesn't it? It's like this is the way to think about writing Go. You don't have to, but like this is how we think about it as the people authoring the language. And it seems strange at first coming from other languages, but the longer you spend, especially if you work in like big companies in an enterprise, like the more this makes sense. The more control you have over your own releases, over your own ecosystem, like your own destiny effectively.
It's also kind of the content of your code.
Yeah, exactly. Like it makes tons of sense.
Libraries is code.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, you mentioned that you saw one big difference in the containerization of PHP versus Go, and how the PHP ones were a lot bigger. So can you talk about this a bit more? When you containerize Go apps, I think most people know what's inside, but for those who did not containerize Go PHP apps, what's there?
Do you want to take a crack at this one, Chris? I know you spent a bunch of time like poking around in both Go and PHP containers, so you might be a better place for answers than I am.
To be honest, I'm not exactly sure what is involved in a PHP container. I mean, yeah, I think the difference between the two is that with Go, you compile it to a native binary. So you can build the binary as part of your Docker file, and then your Docker image essentially just contains that binary. Whereas with PHP, because it's an interpreted language, you kind of have to copy in an interpreter, you have to copy in all of the code and run all of that with inside the bundle and all the assets as well. So I think that's primarily what makes it that much larger than a Go system.
You hit the nail on the head there, because PHP has to have a web server built into it, right? It has PHP like Apache or FPM, I seem to remember it's called. You need to have like a web server, and then usually you have a bunch of like extensions to PHP as well, right, to make it work. Then you need to install Composer and some other things to be able to, as you say, it's interpreted, right? So all these things need to be available to run it. Whereas with Go, it kind of does a build, chucks all that stuff away, and then you just put the binary on the container, which is why it's much smaller.
And the wonderful cross-compilation, all the things that may Go favorites for DevOps people. So if somebody were to migrate from PHP, and I'm asking this as a person based in Berlin, that Berlin used to be such a huge PHP shop, and more places, more and more companies migrated to Go, but there's still a good amount of PHP monolith shops. How would you recommend going about that?
I think my first piece of advice is like to figure out why you're doing it and figure out what success looks like for you. So here's some reasons why I think it's a good idea, and to think about it is you are running like a more performance critical system, and you think it'll be easier to kind of get that performance out of a Go application, or potentially another language's application. The ecosystem is better suited for what you're trying to do, and that's not even migrating from PHP to Go, but like, you know, if you are really going to double down on AI, like maybe, you know, doing all your AI stuff in PHP probably doesn't make sense. It probably does make sense to look at Python if you're going to build your own models. One thing that should not be underestimated is the ability to hire. Like Go is certainly a much sexier language than PHP, and you know, you will attract, in my opinion, better talent, like more talented folks who want to learn Go and potentially want to use it in production. And so, you know, there's definitely reasons that you could look to the hiring market as a good reason to be able to hire. I know in Berlin, as you mentioned, there's a bunch of there's a really hot startup ecosystem, and I know a bunch of them are using Go. So you get to leverage that ecosystem and those people who've been potentially taught how to write Go in production, and they can come along and help you out. So I think just figuring out success is my tip number one. Like, what do you hope to get out of this? And does it really make sense to move from a monolithic application to a distributed system? If you decide that's yes, my advice would be to do the smallest possible thing you can first. So I would always recommend, instead of having one monolith and then a bunch of microservices, maybe consider having two smaller monoliths. Like you have the PHP one, you keep that around, and then you start to build up a Go monolith, if you will, rather than going from a PHP monolith to hundreds of Go microservices, which is kind of what we did. And it worked out okay for us, but I think we introduced more challenges to ourselves along the way than if we'd gone to moving to a simpler, just one other system that was Go.
Because it's all the distributed system considerations you're introducing.
Exactly. And if you just think of it, like the simplest way I think about it is every network hop introduce a point of failure. So the fewer network hops you can have, you know, in a very simplistic terms, the better. There's a lot more to think about than that, I guess. But especially if you're a smaller team who are just kind of starting out and figuring this out, I think that's a fairly reasonable rule to think about and to follow. And so I would do a smaller migration first and just kind of start building up new things, and then follow that strangler pattern, which is start to write your new stuff in Go where it makes sense. But, you know, don't be afraid to hop into the PHP to make small bug fixes and changes too. Remember, ultimately our job is always to deliver business value. So, you know, if there's a piece of work, a Jira ticket or whatever that could be completed in 5 minutes in PHP, but you could rewrite it in 2 weeks and put it in Go, you know, do the 5-minute fix and leave the Go stuff for like the bigger features, and you'll have much more sustainable buy-in, not just even like not even achievement, but like buy-in. Remember, the whole time you're doing this, you've got to keep the business engaged. It's the right thing to do, and it's a good technical decision. So if they ask for a text change and you say it's going to take 3 weeks because you need to rewrite it from PHP to Go, like you're probably going to struggle to keep that buy-in for a long time. Is there anything you'd add to that, Chris?
Yeah, I think the other thing is just be prepared that it will be a learning experience, especially if if your company's not writing Go at the moment, and like if there's not many people maybe with experience writing Go. I think it's a learning experience, and it's worth taking time just to look at how to write Go and how to structure projects and things like that. Because I know, like from experience, like when starting out with Go, like the quality of our services varied massively compared to the ones we were maybe writing a couple of years into that journey. And yeah, like I wouldn't recommend writing Go like you were writing PHP, just because they're just totally different languages and different paradigms. But like there's definitely is a learning experience there, and there definitely is a learning curve. So I think that's the biggest thing. Like be prepared that it might take longer than you expect to actually start getting services out at the start.
You touched on something really interesting there as well, is I think there's this illusion that the PHP is tech debt and the Go is going to be beautiful and it's going to be perfect, and tech debt isn't allowed there. It doesn't exist. And I think, the reality is your first pass at writing any Go, especially if it's going to be a new service and it's your first time doing it, you've got to accept and expect that there's going to be technical debt there too. You're not going to figure out exactly how you want to structure things. You're going to run into a few issues with how Go does things a little bit differently to how you're used to. And so making space for that learning experience that Chris shared is really important, and just having that expectation in your head that we're going to get a bunch of things wrong as we try and go down this path, and we can't assume that this Go is going to be perfect, 'cause it's not going to be.
How would AI change all this? The duration of the migration, the number of mistakes, the missed perspectives? Any bets? I know we're not speaking from experience. We have not been migrating things with AI. There's no tools that do this automatically yet. But with whatever experience you do have with writing code with AI, what are your bets?
I think it could definitely help. I think it can definitely give advice on how to, like things like structuring a project and things about writing code in a more Go-like fashion. Like I think it can definitely help, but I think there's still something to be said for actually doing it yourself and getting your hands dirty and actually like learning what looks correct and what works and what doesn't. So I think it could help the progress, but I wouldn't rely on it, let's say.
Yeah, so it's a really great question. I actually wonder if in the short term it will make it worse, but in the long term it could be better. So the reason I say that is, so I do use coding assistants, especially at home all the time. Like I find them incredibly helpful, but I find them the most helpful when I already know what I'm trying to do. So I'll start a function signature and I can kind of just tab it to completion, but I already knew what I was trying to achieve, right? And it's just helping me do it faster. But I found a few times when I've asked it to write some code to do a specific thing maybe I didn't know too much about, and it's actually not got it quite right, or this was a couple of GPT versions ago, but it actually gave me an SQL query that wasn't escaped, right? And so it actually gave me an SQL vulnerability in the response. And thankfully, I knew what that looked like, so I checked it. But if I didn't, I would have just like, oh, that's how you do SQL queries in Go. Like, let's put that in production. That sounds great. So short term, I think it could be helpful as long as you take the time to kind of think about why it suggested what it did, and you go and do that. But I worry most people won't. I think long term, there's a very great use case here for a long time now, we've been using tools like SonarQube and things like that kind of give you code quality scores and look for basic defects and rules and things like that. You can see AI taking that to the next level and being able to give you a pretty reasonable code review, right? If you've got standards, like Go standards at your work, and you've got a set of sort of like good quality code that you really like and a style that you like, so being able to have a bot do the first pass of that review and just spot all the really easy, obvious things that your colleague is going to call out straight away who's got a bit more experience, that could be really powerful. And then it comes down more to the people just to kind of give the opinion of this doesn't actually quite match the acceptance criteria for this, that, and whatever reason. But purely like code and stylistic and technical issues, you can see AI being able to do probably a better job than humans can at spotting those. There's the joke, isn't there, that if you give someone a 10,000 line PR, you'll get a thumbs up. Looks good to me. But if you give them a 10 line PR, you'll get 10 pieces of feedback. Whereas a bot's probably more likely to actually spot all the issues in the 10,000 line PR because it will take the time to figure them out. Whereas humans kind of, their eyes start to glaze over.
It's true. Humans do rely more on the test automation at this scale. But for now, at least, the AI still has context memory issues. So both different ways of unreliable. But as you say, in the long term, this will be improved and this will be better.
I know you spend a lot more time in this space than we do. Have you seen any really interesting sort of use cases or tools where you think it could help here?
Nothing reliable yet, but the trend is there. The trajectory is there. It's the same challenge that I did not personally witness, but know of, that the memory used to be not sufficient, but now we have enough memory, and this is no longer a limitation.
Interesting.
So I think we will be there.
What did you think of the GPT 4.0 announcement? Like, did it impress you? Like
The Omni.
Yeah.
Yes, actually, we started this podcast where I had to refresh my computer 15 times because I had to close tools one by one, apps one by one. And I bet the ChatGPT desktop app was one of the ones. But yeah, I've been using it nonstop for screenshots and so on. I really enjoy that. It helps me navigate through code, but also things that are not code that I have to deal with, like SAP Ariba. It's a tool that large companies like using for processing invoices. And as a technical person, I have no idea what's going on there, and this is really helping me. But I think when you were talking about the replication lag, I immediately thought of the question, like, if you give it screenshots of, like, this is my dashboard and this is what the app does, what am I missing? Like, give me some more metrics and kind of have the visual feedback. So I would be super curious for something like this. If you do end up trying, please come back and share.
Yeah, that's a really interesting use case, actually. We've we do this thing at Cloudflare where we review other teams' dashboards. So we've started doing it recently where, like, Chris will show up and say, like, hey, here's my dashboard for this service. Like, this is what we're measuring. This is why. This is what you can see. This is why we measure that. And you get critique.
That's a great practice.
It is. And it's useful. You get critique and feedback from other people in the company, like, well, why aren't you measuring this? Like, could this signal have been useful in that incident? Would it have helped you spot it faster? Stuff like that. And what you just said is really interesting to me. Like, could we take a screenshot of that dashboard and just throw it into an AI tool and see, if we gave it enough context, would it give good enough feedback? I'm going to have to try that, and I will definitely come back to you, because I think that's, even if it doesn't get everything perfect, like if you can give sort of the high level things of, you probably should be measuring these things, I think they'd be helpful to you, and it gives someone a jumping off point to go and explore. Like, that could be powerful.
If you have some more capacity for this, I even have an improvement idea that will take a little bit longer than like a 5 minutes conversation. Take some postmortems that you had, like things that you did not understand why something went wrong, and you like investigated and you realized two unrelated things plus the metric and so on, and kind of give these several summaries that you have and say, these are kind of solved problems we had. Find more problems.
That's a really cool idea.
With this dashboard.
I think one of the challenges that we see, and I think a lot of big companies will see, is like we want to kind of own this data. We want to keep it internal, some of it, right? Like we have public facing postmortems, but we have some internal things that we don't share externally too. And so kind of taking this stuff and giving it to like OpenAI or whatever other AI is potentially like a security risk. And I think we actually have to do this for some of our compliance. So I think there's one really interesting use case that I'm still looking for. I haven't seen like great offerings here yet, is being able to deploy some of this stuff on-prem, right?
You can with Azure and so on. You can have even the German health companies, which is like my peak GDPR example. They use their German-based data center instance, and that's like meeting all the requirements. Worth looking into.
Definitely have to take a look. Like we obviously we run our own cloud, right? We don't use any of the other cloud providers. So it might just be we haven't kind of invested the effort to figure out how to deploy this ourselves. But like, I'd be super interested to be able to, because I know there's tons of great open source models now. So I'd love to go and explore that a little bit further. So thanks for the idea. I'm going to add it to my to-do list right now.
So we talked about PHP to go. What are some things you did like about PHP and maybe you're missing?
I'll have to think on that one for you, to be honest.
Other than the mascot, the really cute elephant.
The elephant is cute. I think one thing at the time, again, especially, was the ecosystem. Like there was every library or use case or question you could have, like there was very clear answers to it. And one thing that, this isn't something I personally have a strong preference for, but one reason that a lot of people still love PHP, and it actually seems to be growing, is Laravel specifically is like in a very opinionated, framework about how you should write PHP apps. And if you follow their rules, you will be able to put something in production very, very quickly.
It's a little bit like describing Go.
Yeah.
the opinionated group of doing things.
Yeah, but it takes things a lot further. Like in Laravel, you can be like, generate me a service and a database and like a cache, and it's one command and it'll do it all for you, and it spins you at Redis and Postgres, and it gives you an ORM, and you have to write code in a certain way. Like you can write comments above classes and it will generate stuff for you when you run it, stuff like that. It's like a very hyper opinionated framework for how to build PHP applications, and it's very popular because it's very productive. And I think Encore is probably the closest thing in the space in the Go ecosystem. And I think they're doing a great job. I think Encore is a phenomenal tool, but I think they are having to constantly battle a lot more against this isn't, the Go philosophy. This isn't the Go way to do things. Like we like to write things ourselves. Whereas I think in other languages, like you've got Ruby on the Rails, you've got like Laravel, Spring Boot, the people are a lot more open to this idea. And so I do wonder if we'll ever get there, we'll ever land there with Go. But for now, it's very much being pushed back against, I feel.
Chris, is there something you like about PHP? You liked and miss?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point I was going to make was exactly the same one as Matt said. I think with things like Laravel, you can basically run a single command. It will generate a full project that's production ready. And like you said, you can specify, I want this database, I want Redis, I want maybe even Kafka, things like that. Like you can specify that and it generates all the code for you and it's ready to go out of the box. Like all you have to do is implement your business logic. Yeah, I think there are things like Encore that give you that in Go, but I think they're much less adopted than they are in PHP. And I think, like it removes a lot of the learning curve for PHP. Like you can just write business logic and run it very quickly. Whereas with Go, you do kind of have to learn how to write Go and how to structure projects and things like that ahead of time.
Well, one more unpopular question.
I actually think you should probably leave.
So what are your unpopular opinions? Who would like to start?
I can go first. I know from my unpopular opinion, I know at least one person here will disagree with me straight away. But I think that between 3 and 4 o'clock is the best time to eat lunch.
Wow. Second lunch.
Yeah, I'm eating I'm eating dinner at that time typically. Like that's way too late. I know. I'm actually surprised Natalie disagrees with you. I thought like 3 or 4 p.m. I thought it was like a very European time to be having dinner, having lunch. No.
I can speak for myself that I have multiple meals, and I definitely have my second lunch around 3, but I do have my main lunch around 12. So I partially agree. I don't know. I guess in Spain, it's more common to eat later.
Yeah, I guess because in Spain they have siestas, don't they? But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what the science is behind it, if there is any science, but I swear when I have lunch later in the day like that, I don't get any kind of dips in the afternoon. So I feel like I'm more productive in the afternoon when I eat lunch later.
I don't know. I feel like you have about 6 cups of coffee a day as well. So I think claiming no dips because of late lunch is there's more to that story.
I mean, that probably helps.
Yeah. No, I've always been. I have a terrible habit where I don't eat breakfast at all, which I think is part of my problem. So I usually just have coffee for breakfast. I just find it hard to eat in the morning.
Call that intermediate fasting.
Yeah, I can call it that, but I'd like to claim I did it on purpose. But yeah, I'm type 1 diabetic, so I have to be like religious, I think, about how I eat. So I always found having carbs in the morning for some reason. There are people, sort of health gurus, that claim this is true, but I've certainly seen it in myself that carbs in the morning seem to make my blood sugar go up way higher than they do later in the day. So I found that sort of fasting in the morning and only having black coffee keeps my blood sugar much flatter. I have way more control when I don't. But that also means that I'm hungry much earlier. So whenever Chris and I are in the office, I'm always at like 12, like, come on, let's go get lunch. I'm starving. And Chris has barely finished his breakfast at that point.
Do you have another unpopular opinion other than eating time?
So I have one which I wonder if this is an unpopular or not. I think it certainly would have been unpopular at one point, but I'm not sure if it's still the case. But I think smart home stuff is like really stupid. I completely went all in on the smart home stuff a few years ago. Like I bought all the bulbs and, I wanted to get the sockets and like blinds that open and close themselves. And I moved house recently and I was about 3 months before we moved, I was still pretty insistent this was going to be the smartest house I ever lived in. And then we had a power cut and I couldn't open my blinds. And I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, imagine a world where you can't like open your blinds because there's been, the internet's not working. And I know there's sort of clever things you can do to avoid that, but it really put me off. And I've gone the complete opposite way now. I've got really dumb stuff in our house now. And I have no intention to really invest in smart things again. I had like 5 Alexas in our old house and I don't have one in this house. Could potentially be sold on another AI assistant if it was actually smarter than Alexa was, but haven't seen anything in that space yet. Surprisingly, it feels like a really natural use case for OpenAI stuff. So I'm just waiting for them to sell an Alexa style thing, and I'll probably get one.
So if to summarize your opinion to one sentence that we can then tweet and have a poll and actually evaluate, smart homes should not be a thing, or how would you phrase that?
Yeah, I don't think smart homes should be a thing. I think everybody is better off with a dumb house.
Interesting. I don't have a feeling where will this go, but I am curious.
What do you think, Chris?
So, funnily enough, I have Philips Hue light bulbs, but I think we changed the light plugs or something like a couple of years ago, and they stopped working. So now I just use the light bulbs as regular light bulbs. So I think I somewhat agree. Like, there's some things are just easier just to have them done, but no, I definitely do think there are some advantages to having smart homes.
The light bulbs is something I enjoy. It's convenient that when I go into the bathroom, there's a sensor and I don't have to, like with dirty hands, touch the light switch. I specifically like that one thing. And if the internet goes out, I can always still click on the button. But that's where it kind of ends for me. It's true. It's frustrating how assistants are useless.
Yeah. It also is, it just shows where Amazon really fumbled as well, right? They had such a lead with Alexa. Like, it actually bothers me that they're not the ones like presenting like all this stuff that OpenAI are, and Google too. Like, it felt like theirs to win, you know? I don't really know how we got here. So massive props to OpenAI for, you know, being massively behind, at least on paper, having this, like, you know, they went up against, you know, Google and Amazon and Microsoft, and they're clearly leading the pack. When if I had to bet 5 years ago who it was going to be, like, it would have 100% been Amazon Alexa is going to be the one to take this.
My unpopular opinion is around which best strawberry ice cream flavor is the best. And I had a poll, so I can confirm this is unpopular, but I think that definitely the best thing you can do with strawberry ice cream is make it mint strawberry.
Interesting. I don't know if I've ever had...
Not basil strawberry, not creamy strawberry, and also not sorbet strawberry. Plain. Mint strawberry.
I don't know if I've ever had mint strawberry ice cream. I'm going to have to go and try it. But I will say there's a strawberry ice cream from Haagen-Dazs. I think it's German, so I'm really sorry if I've just butchered the name of it.
Haagen-Dazs is not German. Americans made up a name that sounds European, but it's like not in any European language.
So that was even more offensive than saying it wrong, wasn't it? But they do a strawberry cheesecake ice cream, and it's phenomenal. Like, it's probably one of my favorite ice creams. So I will try strawberry mint, but I'm gonna say my default is that strawberry cheesecake is probably one of the best ice creams that's ever been created.
And I'm probably going to give an even more unpopular opinion now by saying I'm not actually a massive fan of ice cream. So, yeah, I've never tried strawberry mint, but yeah, generally I'm not a huge fan of ice cream, so I don't really eat it a lot.
Try to live somewhere where it's sunny. Sorry.
Yeah, that would help.
I think we deserve that for me saying Haagen-Dazs was German.
We have a few months of pleasant weather a year. It just starts now, so I get to celebrate. Well, this has been an interesting conversation. Thank you for sharing your experience moving from PHP to Go. We mentioned some cool stuff. We will include them in the show notes, and we will tweet all the unpopular opinions to see which one is the most unpopular. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot. Yeah,
I'm trading changelog sticker packs for thoughtful 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or blog posts recommending GoTime. Simply send evidence of your review or blog post to gotime@changelog.com alongside a mailing address, and I'll send you free stickers right to your mailbox. Once again, that's gotime@changelog.com. Go ahead, get your sticker on. Thanks once again to our partners at Fly.io, to our Beat Freakin' residents, Breakmaster Cylinder, and to our friends at Sentry. Use code CHANGELOG when you sign up and save $100 on their team plan. Why not, right? That's all for now, but we'll talk to you again next time on Go Time.